Hello and welcome to this quick guide on game boundaries in Crayta. A game boundary is the limiting edge of your play space for the game that you're making in Crayta. And what that means is, where is your play space defined? It can't be infinite, so where is the finite edge of your play space? How do you tell your player that that is the edge of the play space? And how do you make sure that aesthetically and narratively it makes sense? So considering the aesthetics, the theme, the narrative of what's going on in your game is really important when you're considering your strategy for approaching the edges of your game. Now, there is no finite solution to this problem. There is no correct answer. There are lots of different ways of doing this, and more are being invented all the time. There's actually probably an infinite array of solutions depending on the different mechanics and different types of game that we have that you're making. So what I'm going to do in this quick guide is just present a couple of options that you might want to consider depending on the theme and the mechanics of your game. So the first one is a wall. It is the most simple and most direct form of game boundary. Make your game indoors or make it outdoors but with walls. That is a really simplified approach to how to make the edge of your game. It tells your player that this is the edge of your game in a really easy to understand way. An alternative to that is to make walls the edge of your game boundary, but to also use windows so that you can tell a story beyond those walls. So, for example, just putting some minor dressing outside of those semi-transparent boundaries, just to build a little bit more of the universe and a bit more of the narrative around your game. Now, if we scoot over to this one, the obvious next step from walls or semi-transparent walls is completely transparent walls. So here I have invisible walls in this game. Although whilst they're invisible, I would recommend that you signify somehow to your players that there is a limited game space. Something like this red line here, which is actually where my invisible wall is situated, can help to tell your player to stop at this point, or that there is not to expect to go beyond this point, and stop them from searching for an entrance to or an exit to this invisible wall. When you're using invisible walls, you may also find you need to dress beyond that wall. So if we just look at this horizon in this direction here, I've added a little bit of detail outside of the invisible wall, and that will obviously need more time than, say, outside of the windows here, which again needs more time than just the wall there. So progressively taking more and more time to add to your game world, but can also make it feel more and more immersive and more polished too. So one thing I wanted to point out is I see this quite a lot in games in Crayta. And this is a really cool approach where you use fog to sort of blur the very edge of your game map. And you make sure that the player can't get to a point where they can see where the edge of the game map is. Maybe using invisible walls here, for example, to stop the player from being able to swim out to that point. If, however, you offer your player opportunities to swim in water in your game, but not at this point, that could be quite a jarring experience and could break immersion. And similarly, if I climb to the top of this and go to an elevated position, I can really easily see where the edge of the game world is. So a couple of things to bear in mind if you're using the disappearing into the fog approach like that. Another alternative is the dissolving edges method, which ties in really nicely to the narrative around Crayta. So if you want your game to be aware of its context, of the fact that it's within Crayta as a platform, you could lean into the dissolving voxels like you will see in the hub, and you'll see them in the comics as well, because they tell your player in the same consistent visual language, this is the edge of the game world. You can jump around on these voxels if you want to, but there isn't anything else, and if you jump off you'll die and respawn. It's using a couple of design principles which I talk about more in the full-length tutorial, but dissolving edges is a really good way to limit the game space without necessarily breaking immersion, because the player is still immersed in Crayta as an entity. So that can be quite fun. next up, we start looking at more realistic approaches, more detailed approaches, but again, more time-consuming approaches. So this is a technique I like to call overlapping geometry. So here we have two buildings. Between them is an alleyway. And this is the edge of my game world where this chain link fence is. And what I'm trying to do here is soften up the hard two-dimensional wall that you will experience in one of the other in the walled garden approach, just by adding a few objects in front, maybe meshes, maybe voxels, or however you want to do that. So to sort of break up this wall here, and then adding more elements behind as well. So we've got narratively and contextually aware elements like elevated walkways, buildings, maybe some meshes, or maybe some other fences, multiple fences, so that you're adding depth. You've got layers here, multiple layers of kind of boundaries, but you're also you should also bear in mind that the more detail you make outside of your game world, the more it looks like the player can go there and do things. So be really aware. Don't put loads of levers and things that look very interactable beyond the game boundary, because the player will be surprised when they can't get to that point, or be constantly searching to try and get there and be disappointed when they do and nothing happens. So yeah, overlapping geometry is a good way to add narrative depth and immersion to your game, but it can be very time consuming to make these things look good, and it's often a case of how much time do you have to make the game as to how much time do you want to spend on your game boundaries. I would recommend that you make the game really, really fun, and then your players won't necessarily be looking for the game boundaries or noticing any discrepancy with your game boundary. But that said, it adds a lot of polish and a lot of feel good when you have a cool looking boundary to your game. And finally, the last game boundary I wanted to talk about was a more natural approach to a game boundary. So this is leveraging the fog in a slightly different way, because what we're doing here is we're using the fact that it gradually masks further and further layers of geometry. So whilst this is completely impassable here, we've made some we've got some voxel meshes that are behaving almost like mountains in the landscape, and they're in layers. So we've got a close, a medium, and a far layer. And if you notice, they're similar to the buildings in that they're actually increasing in height. If you go out into nature and look into the distance, it's unlikely you'll be able to see exactly to the horizon, because there'll always be something blocking your view, overlapping each other, or mountains or hills or whatever it is, unless you're looking out to sea, in which case you can probably see the horizon. So just trying to emulate that in the game. And if I stand my player here and I move side to side, what the layers does that's really nice, the layers of mountains, is they move at different speeds. So we've got the furthest away one moves slowest, the nearest one to us moves fastest, and we've also got this horizon at the edge there. So if you go to advanced mode, world tab, scroll down to horizon, you can choose to have a different kind of aesthetic for the vista that surrounds your entire game, and that can tell a part of the story too, and blend it nicely with some voxel meshes to soften up that boundary. Again, with this approach, you will still need some kind of way of stopping the player from just jumping off the edge, or allow them to jump off the edge and respawn. It's entirely up to you however you want to approach that. For example, this river or stream I've got here may be impassable. I might make this an invisible wall, and then just use that as a consistent visual language throughout the game to make sure that players stay inside the game boundary. One other thing to be aware of, if I just scoot over to this beanstalk and plot my player up there, if I'm really high up, I can see the layers of the mountains, and it breaks immersion. So similar to the beach scenario, be aware that an elevated position can break the look of your game boundary, and you will need to consider how high your players can stand when you're thinking about what the edge of your game looks like. And so it might just be you need to spend more time on making more and more layers because you can see further away when you're higher up. Or it may be you find some other cool, innovative solution to this. Hopefully this has been an interesting and useful quick guide. I look forward to seeing how you use it to reinterpret your game boundaries in Crayta.